My name is Nancy, and I want you to picture this. You're sitting across from your father, the same man who spent years reminding you how much you owe him. He's laughing, confident, certain of his control, until he realizes you've just outplayed him completely. His face drains of all color, the smile collapses, and everything he built, everything he thought he owned, now legally belongs to you. That moment took 10 long years to create, and I swear, every minute of pain leading up to it was worth it. But before we get to that final scene, let's rewind. If you've ever felt powerless under someone who thought they ruled your life, this story will feel like gasoline on a long, smoldering flame. So buckle up, because karma sometimes needs a push, and I was done waiting for fate to do the work for me. For most kids my age, summer meant sleep-ins, sunshine, and ice cream melting too fast to eat. For me, summer meant servitude. It started on my 13th birthday. My father, George, ran a tiny corner convenience shop. A dingy place that smelled of stale coffee and dusted chips, the kind of store that survived solely because it was on the way to somewhere better. Every June, like clockwork, he'd corner me in the kitchen with the same line. Nancy, family helps family. You start Monday. No negotiation, no pay, no freedom to argue. I was 13, but by the following week I was running a cash register I could barely reach. I can still feel the sticky air from that humid first summer. The buzz of tired fluorescent lights above me. The ache of my fingers as I stocked freezing soda bottles until my skin stung. 10-hour days that left my back screaming. My friends, Margaret and Carol, were at pool parties, posting selfies with neon floats and cold sodas. Meanwhile, I mopped up sticky footprints and swept aisles that no one noticed were clean. Why doesn't he ever hire real employees? I asked my mother one night, trying to massage my ankles after another 14-hour day. She didn't even look up from her magazine. Your father knows what he's doing. Don't question him. That single sentence became her lifelong refrain. It stung even more to see my brother Brian live a completely different reality. He never had to work the counter or clean the bathrooms. He went to summer camps, slept late, took vacations with friends. I was the workhorse. He was the heir. George praised him endlessly for focusing on his studies while calling me slow, distracted, ungrateful. Year after year, I told myself it was temporary. That one day, he'd notice my dedication and finally reward it. But George didn't see me as a daughter. He saw me as cheap labor, reliable, obedient, and expendable. High school blurred into exhaustion. Mornings spent unlocking the store at dawn, nights bent over homework long after midnight. Friends stopped inviting me to hang out after the 100th. I can't. I have to work. By graduation, my social life had withered down to a single steady companion, my father's cash register. I was invisible except when he needed something. College was supposed to be my escape. I got into a good program, moved 2 towns over, and found a sliver of freedom. But even from afar, George never loosened his grip. Your education doesn't excuse you from family responsibilities, he said on the phone each summer. And remember, this shop's paying for your tuition. That was his favorite lie. I had student loans for tuition and a part-time job for expenses. He hadn't paid a cent. Yet somehow, in his version of reality, I owed him everything. By my 2nd year of college, I started seeing his pattern for what it was. Control disguised as duty. The worst part wasn't even the long hours. It was hearing him joke with customers. Why would I pay staff when I've got free labor? My daughter never quits. They'd laugh, unaware that his joke was my actual life. His words became the soundtrack in my head during every sleepless night. Why pay someone when I have Nancy? By junior year, something inside me finally snapped, but not in defeat. In focus. I stopped imagining rescue. I started planning. Every shift, every ledger entry, every order became information, something I could use. When I graduated, I thought I'd be free. I already had a job offer waiting. Marketing associate, solid salary, real future. But at breakfast that June, George barely looked up from his newspaper when he said, "You'll work the shop until September. You owe me that much." I stared at him differently that day. Really saw him. This man who'd stolen my youth and convinced himself it was charity. What if I refuse? I asked, my voice calm but deadly steady. He looked up, his gray eyes cold as stone. Then you can find somewhere else to live. See how far you get without family support. That was when I realized he had no idea who he was dealing with anymore. He still saw a scared teenager. He didn't see the woman who'd spent 10 years learning every crack in his armor. So I smiled sweetly and said, "Of course, Dad. Family helps family." Inside, though, I was vibrating. A plan had already taken shape. Clean, elegant, lawful, unforgiving. You see, George's superstition wasn't bad luck or bad customers. It was laziness, pure and simple. Every bit of paperwork, every tedious admin task, he dumped it on me. I'd filed the tax returns, renewed the lease, negotiated supplier contracts, handled every inspection. My signature was everywhere. That night, I spread 10 years of documents across my bedroom floor. Receipts, leases, invoices, tax records. Line after line, there it was, my name. 10 years of legal breadcrumbs linking me to a business that, on paper, could easily be seen as mine. But paperwork alone wasn't enough. I needed leverage, proof, allies, so I went hunting. A coffee chat with Laura from the property management company. A friendly lunch with Nicholas from the supplier's office. Harmless-sounding questions about ownership structures, lease transfers, purchase options. I made notes, smiled, learned. The final breakthrough came from the most unexpected person of all, Mr. Ronald Peterson, the elderly landlord who owned the property where George's store sat. I'd dealt with him for years, mostly calming him down whenever my father's rent was late. George was, to put it mildly, a terrible tenant. One humid afternoon, during a routine conversation about maintenance, I casually mentioned, "It must be stressful managing so many rental properties." He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "Honestly, Nancy, I'd rather sell. Your father's been a headache. Late payments, property damage, threats whenever I try to enforce the lease terms. I'd sell that building tomorrow if I found the right buyer." My heart pounded, but I kept my voice casual. What would something like that cost? The number wasn't small, but it wasn't impossible either. Years of having no social life meant I'd actually managed to save money. Combined with my signing bonus from the marketing job and a loan from college roommate Jason, who owed more favors than I could count, I could make it work. The next 2 months were the most terrifying and exhilarating of my life. Secret meetings with lawyers, careful financial planning, sleepless nights wondering if I was making a massive mistake. But every morning when George barked orders at me like I wash his property, my resolve hardened. I was going to teach him what real family loyalty looked like. The closing happened on a Wednesday. I'll never forget sitting in that lawyer's office, signing document after document while my hands trembled with adrenaline. When the lawyer handed me the keys and said, "Congratulations, Miss Nancy. You're now the owner." I had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe. I owned it. The building, the business, everything George thought belonged to him. Legally, completely, irreversibly mine. But I wasn't ready to play my hand yet. I needed the perfect moment. It came the next morning. George strutted into the shop 45 minutes late, coffee in hand, complaining about traffic. He didn't even acknowledge me as he headed toward his usual spot behind the counter. "Nancy, those shelves look like garbage. Restock everything and do it right this time. And the floor needs mopping. What the hell have you been doing all morning?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. My hands were steady now. Steady as stone. "Actually, George, I need to give you something." He barely glanced up. "Can it wait? I've got suppliers calling and open it." Something in my tone made him look at me properly for the first time in years. He took the envelope, frowning as he tore it open. I watched his face as he processed the deed, saw the exact moment his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. "What? What is this?" "It's the deed to this building, George. My name is on it now, which means this is my shop, and you." I took a step closer, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're trespassing," he sputtered, the paper shaking in his hands. "This is fake. This is impossible. You can't what? Buy a building, start a business, make decisions about my own property." I pulled out my phone because I'm pretty sure I can also decide who gets to stay and who needs to leave. "Young, rateful little. Choose your next words very carefully, George, because I'm calling the police, and I'd hate for them to hear you threatening the property owner." I dialed 911 while he stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When the officers arrived 20 minutes later, George was still standing in the same spot, staring at the deed like it might transform into something else if he looked long enough. "Officers, this man is refusing to leave my property," I said calmly, handing them a copy of the deed and my identification. The rest happened like a dream. George's protests, his demands that they talk sense into his daughter, his increasing desperation, as the officers politely but firmly explained that property owners have rights. When they finally escorted him out, he turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Nancy. I'll sue you for everything." "I know," I called after him. "It is over. It's been over since the day you decided I was property instead of family." George tried to fight the eviction. Of course, he hired a lawyer and argued that he had a right to renew his lease, that I was retaliating against him as his daughter, but the law was crystal clear. As the property owner, I had the right to accuse my tenants. The lease had expired, and I was under no obligation to renew it. His lawyer actually seemed embarrassed during the proceedings. When the judge asked George to provide evidence of any illegal actions on my part, he had nothing. I'd bought the property fair and square with my own money. I'd followed all proper legal procedures. There was no fraud, no forgery, no illegal activity, just a smart business move by someone he'd underestimated. The case was dismissed so quickly that George's lawyer looked relieved to be done with it. In the hallway afterward, I heard him telling George that property law was pretty straightforward, and that family relationships don't override business law. George aged 10 years in that courtroom. Watching him realize that his own laziness and poor financial management had created the opportunity for his downfall was almost worth the decade of abuse. Almost. The real satisfaction came later. I hired Margaret and Carol, my old friends who'd never stopped hoping I'd find a way out. I hired Amanda to design the shop layout, and Rebecca to handle social media marketing. I paid them all fair wages, gave them benefits, treated them like the valuable team members they were. Business boomed. It turns out that when you treat employees like human beings instead of property, they actually care about their work. When you treat customers with respect instead of barely concealed contempt, they want to keep shopping with you. The neighborhood regulars were thrilled. "Wheelways hated how your father treated you," Mrs. Chen told me one afternoon. "Half of us shopped elsewhere just because we couldn't stand watching it anymore." That's when I realized George hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been sabotaging his own business through his cruelty. The poetic justice was overwhelming. 6 months later, I was locking up my shop when I saw a familiar figure across the street. George looking older and smaller, somehow staring at the building that used to define his identity. For just a moment, I felt something that might have been a pity. Then I remembered 13-year-old Nancy, crying herself to sleep because she was missing another friend's birthday party. I remembered college. Nancy watching her social life crumble because she could never commit to plans. I remembered all the times he'd called me useful while calling Brian his pride and joy. Thepity evaporated. George had taught me that family loyalty was a one-way street, that my value lay only in what I could provide him. In the end, I'd simply applied his own lesson. I'd taken everything he could provide me, and I'd discarded him when he was no longer useful. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply turning someone's own values against them with surgical precision. As I walked to my car that evening, keys jingling in my pocket, Ismailed. Not because I'd destroyed my father, though I had, but because I'd finally become the person I was always meant to be. Free, powerful, and absolutely done with being anyone's unpaid labor. They say living well is the best revenge, but living well on the grave of your oppressor's dreams, that's even better. If this story gave you chills, you're not alone. Just as this calculation doesn't happen by accident, it takes years of patience and the perfect moment to strike. Hit that subscribe button if you believe karma sometimes needs a helping hand. And drop a comment telling me what would you have done in NY's situation. Because something tells me this isn't the last revenge story we'll be covering on this.